Here in part two of today's lecture, which is our third lecture for the week, um, I ended with the question in the first part of that lecture, of this lecture. I ended with the question about the relationship between the idea of blues and sadness. And of course, we use in normal vernacular, in normal parlance, if I'm feeling blue, meaning I'm feeling down, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling sad. And so there's a way in which we've come to associate the blues with lamentation, with sadness, with sorrow and regret. I'm going to get into this with a great deal of depth in a little bit, but it's interesting that that is typically, if we ask the question, what makes a blues song, we think of it as that it's got to be sad. And I think that needs to be really carefully examined, of course, because um, there is something about the relationship between sadness and entertainment that seems to be somehow in a clashing situation when we think of the blues. One of the great contemporary African American philosophers and thinkers, a brilliant man, Cornel West, describes himself as a blues man. And in a sense, he comes to this conclusion amongst a number of other self-identifications. He understands himself to be part of a Christology and a belief system that believes in the salvific nature of human experience, the idea of faith, and so on and so forth. But in describing his sense of how he moves through the world, he declares himself a blues man, and he does that again in the context of talking about the way in which he thinks about his relationships and the way in which he thinks about his own ideas about his relationship to the world, to people, and how he approaches the world. Why does he call himself a blues man? A blues man is sort of seen as somebody who travels. A blues man is seen as a troubadour. A blues man is somebody who's creative capacity and creative forces are the things that guide him and drive him and make him move and make him work in the world and operate in the world. One of the great stories about some of the great blues artists, blues recording artists, one of the great stories is the story of a blues man. And I'll tell you more about his name and so on and so forth. But here's the story about the blues man. The blues man, before he was ever a blues man, but was trying to be, was very interested in the blues. And he decides that he's going for a walk. He decides to go for a walk. This is how the story goes. He goes to, and he ends up at the crossroads. The crossroads is the meeting places of four roads. And at the crossroads, he meets the devil. And the devil then proposes to him that if he will give his soul to the devil will give him incredible talent as a musician. And the story goes that the man decides to give his soul to the devil. Devil takes the soul, and he becomes the great originator of the blues, one of the first great blues musicians. And in a sense, there's this articulation that the blues then becomes the thing that replaces the soul that he's lost. In other words, the blues then becomes something of value and of worth that is hugely important. Now, if we take this as a beginning story, and this is a story that has been repeated throughout the annals of blues music and so on and so forth, I think if we take this story and begin to sort of examine it and to think about it as a framework, to think about how we consider the function and the operation of the blues, we are recognizing in that narrative that there is something about being called into the creative pursuit, being called into the artistic pursuit, being fully and totally committed to creating great art at the expense of everything else, including one's soul. In a sense, then, it is affirming that that the blues, that this capacity for an individual to make the decision to be that, to be this gifted and talented musician, is an important and vital part of the spirit of African Americans in quest of a sense of an articulation and an affirmation of the self, affirmation of their identity and their self. But let's think about the blues as as a form. In your book, you're going to encounter a number of examples of the blues, and one of them that I think is worth paying attention to, a blues song that was sung by Bessie Smith, um, and it's called "Downhearted Blues," and it's one of the songs that the lyrics are in the text. And Bessie Smith was a remarkable blues musician. In fact, one of the interesting things about the blues is that during the 1920s and then right up until the 1940s and 1950s, quite frankly, some of the greatest recordings of blues music was done by women. African American women were dominated the blues, whether it was Bessie Smith, whether it was Ma Rainey. Um, these were all, there's a whole slew of names, and they were recording artists who were traveling and performing. You may have seen The Color Purple, the film, and it features Shug Avery, who is a blues singer. The 1920s were really important for the blues. I remember some years ago, in 1986, that's many years ago, I was in the States for the first extended time that I was in the States on a fellowship. And I managed to get a chance to visit the blues archives, which were just beginning to take shape in significant ways in Mississippi, in Oxford, Mississippi. And one of the things that they did for you was that you could go in and they show you all the blues musicians and so on and so forth, all the records, and I could ask them to just record them. So I got them to put on little tape recorders blues song after blues song, all by women blues musicians, and these songs were remarkable, beautiful, funny, ribald, just outrageous. And to think that in 1920 these women were singing songs about their gay sensibility. They were singing songs about the love that they had. They've sing songs about leaving men. They've sing songs about all kinds of things in the kind of bold and dramatic way as early as the 1920s. And so this was the blues became not, so I talk about the idea of articulating a sense of self and a sense of one's individuality. And this was a path that many women were taking, African American women were taking in the work that they did. And like I said, somebody like Bessie Smith was one of those blues singers whose death was tragic eventually, where she was in a car accident and she was rushed to a white hospital because this is how the world worked in those days. And they told her they would not care for her. And she had to drive, they had to drive her many miles away to find a black hospital that would care for her. By the time she arrived, well, she was dead on arrival. So Bessie Smith's story is a really tragic but beautiful story. Beautiful story. But here's the blues, downhearted blues. The lyric is something like this: Gee, but it's hard to love someone when that someone don't love you. I'm so excited. I'm so downhearted. I got the downhearted blues. And it's an interesting strophe that begins at a kind of introductory thing. She's talking about how difficult it is, and she's saying that she's got the downhearted blues. And then we get these verses, and this is a perfect musical piece for us to understand the construction, the formal construction of the blues. The formal construction of the blues. All right. She sings, Trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days. Trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days. It seems like trouble's gonna follow me to my grave. And so this is the lyric. and she's lamenting the story, as you can see in the song. She says, my man has left me and I'm so sad and I'm so down. And then she laments, trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days. And repeats it, trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days. It seems like trouble will follow me to my grave. And that is the classic blues verse. Line, repeat the line, and then a kind of turn, which gives you a punchline. And the construction is rhetorical because, of course, it is line and rhetorically re-emphasizing the line and then following it by a turn, which is reinterpreting the line and sort of concluding it. So that they're these pockets. The blues are these pockets of explosive poetry, almost in the sense that haiku is a piece of construction that has this way of containing within it, by its formal construction, a certain gem of wisdom. Well, the blues would follow this pattern, right? And it's a very interesting way in which the blues would operate. And if we think about people like Elvis Presley, who learned much of what he was doing by paying attention to the blues and was a blues singer, and of course imitating and recording the work of blues artists. You ain't nothing but a hound dog. All of these are lyrics that he was singing songs that were recorded initially by African Americans. Elvis Presley's fame was built on that. But the structure is the same. You ain't nothing but a hound dog just running around. You ain't nothing but a hound dog just running around. You ain't nothing but something, blah, 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 blah. All right, so there's a structure, right? And that structure is repeated. And we see this recurring everywhere in music, again and again. But it's interesting that the rhetorical construct is line, repeat line, punchline. And that punchline is the articulation of epiphany. That punchline is also the articulation of revelation and also humor. So even though we talk about the blues as sadness or sorrow, the very construction of the blues song belies that. In fact, what we see is not just the articulation of pain, but the sublimation of pain. The sublimation of pain. So let's take that same song, Downhearted Blues. Downhearted Blues is a sad song, but is it a sad song? By the time we get to the end of the song, all right? I mean, because this is a song where she tells the story about when her man left her. And she declares that at some point, this man is going to be mine, all mine, right? And when the song then has this moment of fascinating change when she says, it may be a week, it may be a month or two. I said, it may be a week, it may be a month or two. But the day you left me, honey, it's coming home to you. Now, this is not lamentation, but actually a threat. A threat and a curse. So that the song, which is a song lamenting the loss of the man, turns into a kind of celebration of the destruction of the man through this bold act of defiance, this bold act of resistance. So one would imagine then, because of course the question is, what if the blues is attempting to articulate pain, then all that one would have to do is scream, ouch, cry, shout. But what makes you turn that into art, into song? And not just song, but formal song. And song that has resonance, and song that has expectations that the audience understands. Because you see, the blues audience, as all audiences, understand the construction of the blues. Trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days. The audience is anticipating something. The audience can actually repeat the second line. I said, trouble, trouble, I've had it all my days. And then the audience, in anticipation, waits for, it seems like trouble's gonna follow me to my grave. It may be a week, it may be a month or two. It may be a week, it may be a month or two. But the day you left me, honey, it's coming home to you. Now, boom, 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 right? And there's the anticipation of it. There's the anticipation of the meaning of it. And there's the anticipation that lifts it from just pure lamentation into turning pain into art. And this is the great, fantastic thing about the blues. And this is the revolutionary act in the blues. So when you go through this book and you go through all the blues of floods, the blues of going on the train track and riding away, the blues of violence done to people, all of these are blues songs, but they are blues songs that are taking pain and turning them into song, and turning them into song as part of entertainment. And not masochistic entertainment, but entertainment that means there is a sublimation, a lifting out of, a way to see a path out of the pain. That if one can't laugh in the midst of deepest tragedy and pain, then one is ceding one's humanity. And the blues are actively defying that notion, and constructing a way to do it. So think about its structure. Line, repeat line, punch line. This is very important in understanding it. Now, the blues have gone on to think, if we think of the blues then, we think of the blues as telling the individual story. The blues is always telling a story. That is, inside a blues song is a narrative, somebody's experience, going through different stages. It's also the story of an individual in the world. The world is typically against the individual, and the individual is trying to understand themselves in the world and trying to express who they are in the world to the people around them. And in a sense, it is that idea that affects people like that, moves people like Langston Hughes, that moves, people, writers like Ralph Ellison, that moves to this day, writers who are thinking about, Cornel West talks about himself as a blues man. It is that transformatory function, that way in which the blues becomes a way to transform experience into something that is sublimated, lifted above. And that, in a sense, becomes not kind of, but actually fundamentally transformative. The blues made money for people. The blues made a life for people. When we come to look at the plays of August Wilson, for instance, he talks about the blues. He talks about the ways in which the blues was the way in which he learned how to be a man, from the songs that were sung and the ways in which the men talked about their own selves and their own understanding of themselves. The blues were a way for women to talk about their own experiences. Rainey was talking about her love of women, her sexuality in very explicit ways, where she explicitly says that she's not looking for a man, she's looking for a woman. This is radical. This is radical in 1920, 1921, 22, when these songs, "Prove It on Me" blues came up. "Prove It on Me" blues was a blues about her sexuality, and she was simply saying that, and it's in our text. You should look at it. "Prove It on Me" blues was simply saying, well, you got to prove it. You think that I'm gay, but you've got to prove it to me. But she's then saying, but I am singing it. So what do you do with that? And that is the path that the blues created. When we think of rock and roll, and people talk about the radical nature of rock and roll and the iconoclastic role of rock and roll was simply a follow through on what was already established and continues to be functioning at the basis of the anti-establishment function of the blues, because of course the African American, who was the blues artist, was always the radical figure in the midst of a very repressive and oppressive system. And for many African Americans, the blues becomes the way in which, a secular way in which they can articulate their community, their communal sense, their liberation, and their profound individuality.